The candles at Winterbourne Manor burned lower than they should have, as though even the wax wished to look away. Duchess Jessica sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her spine straight as a bell rope, watching her husband laugh too loudly at something Lady Penelope had whispered into his ear. 40 guests filled the hall that night, silk and jewels and powdered wigs, and every single one of them knew. She could feel it in the way conversations dipped when she passed, in the way the dowager countesses exchanged glances over their wine glasses, in the small, cruel mercy of pity. Anthony, 7th Duke of Winterbourne, had never been a subtle man. He did not hide Lady Penelope behind closed doors or discreet arrangements, the way other husbands manage their indiscretions. He had brought her to his own Christmas Eve ball, seated her 3 chairs from his wife, and draped his arm along the back of Penelope's chair as though daring the room to comment. Jessica smiled through it. She always smiled through it. Snow pressed against the leaded windows in soft, insistent drifts, and somewhere beyond the warmth of the hall, the Yorkshire moors lay buried under a foot of white silence. She had grown up watching snow like that from a much smaller window in a much colder house, and she had learned long ago that the coldest things rarely announce themselves with noise. They simply arrived, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to stop them. "You're not eating, Your Grace," murmured Lady Featherstone beside her, not unkindly. "I find I've little appetite tonight," Jessica said, and reached for her wine instead. Across the table, Anthony caught her eye. Just once, just long enough to let a small, satisfied smirk cross his mouth, the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won something. He had no notion of what he had actually lost. He would not have believed it if she'd told him. 7 years she had been his Duchess. 7 years of being spoken of as the quiet one, the plain one, the girl from the crumbling Westmoreland estate who had married up and should be grateful for the privilege. 7 years of Anthony gambling away tenant rents at White's, of Anthony borrowing against timber he hadn't yet felled, of Anthony assuming that because she asked no questions, she understood nothing. He had never once asked what she did with her days. At the stroke of midnight, the clock in the great hall began its slow, resonant chime, and Jessica rose from her chair. The room did not fall silent. The orchestra kept playing, the guests kept murmuring, but something in her stillness drew eyes toward her regardless. She walked the length of the table, her heeled slippers silent against the old stone floor, until she stood directly behind her husband's chair. Anthony turned, mildly annoyed at the interruption, Penelope's laughter dying on her lips. Jessica placed a folded paper on the white tablecloth before him. Cream-colored, sealed once already broken, the ink of a solicitor's careful hand visible beneath the fold. "What is this?" Anthony said, more statement than question, already reaching for his glass rather than the paper. "A deed of separation," Jessica said, her voice even and quiet, pitched only for him and the small circle nearest them. "Signed, witnessed. You'll find everything in order." The nearest guests had gone still now. Wine glasses paused halfway to open mouths. Anthony's smirk faltered, though he tried to hold it. "Jessica, go spend Christmas with your mistress," she said. And there was no anger in it, no tremor, nothing for the watching room to feed on. Only a terrible, quiet finality, the kind that comes from a decision made long before the words that announce it. "I find I no longer wish to share the table." She did not wait for his answer. She turned, gathered the pale folds of her skirt, and walked from the hall with the same unhurried grace she had carried into it, leaving behind a silence that no orchestra could quite fill again that night. By the time the last of the guests had staggered to their carriages and Anthony had drunk himself into a stupor of confusion and wounded pride, the manor had gone dark and still, snow gathering thick against every sill. No one saw the carriage that left the eastern gate before dawn. No one heard the horses, muffled as they were with cloth-wrapped hooves, moving carefully down the frozen drive and out onto the moor road. The single lamp burning in the Duchess's private chamber went out some time before 4 in the morning, and when her lady's maid came to wake her at 8, as she did every day of the year, she found the bed unmade, the wardrobe half emptied, and the small writing desk by the window swept entirely clean. Duchess Jessica was gone. And by the time Duke Anthony woke, groaning, past noon on Christmas Day, nursing a head full of brandy and a wounded sort of confusion he could not yet name, he had no earthly idea that the woman he had spent 7 years underestimating had already set into motion something far colder and far more deliberate than any snowstorm Yorkshire had ever seen. Boxing Day brought no relief to Winterbourne Manor, only a colder sort of daylight creeping across the frost-hardened lawns. Anthony woke past 10 with a skull that felt cracked down the middle and a temper to match. The servants moved through the corridors with the particular quiet of people who have learned, through long experience, that a duke nursing wounded pride is more dangerous than a duke nursing a genuine grief. He would not speak of the deed of separation, would not even glance at the folded paper still sitting untouched on his writing table, where a footman had placed it the previous morning. Instead, he called for his steward, a stooped, careful man named Hollis, who had served the Winterbourne family for 30 years, and gave him a single instruction: fetch her jewel chests and the dowry papers. If she means to play at independence, she'll play it without a farthing of mine funding the performance. Hollis bowed and withdrew, and Anthony returned to his brandy, with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had just delivered a decisive blow. It took less than an hour for that satisfaction to curdle into something else entirely. Hollis returned to the study, with a face gone the color of old parchment, his hands trembling faintly as he set down the estate ledger he carried. "Your Grace," he began, and then seemed unable to continue, so Anthony rose and followed him down through the manor's older wing, past the kitchens, down the narrow stone stairs, to the strong room beneath the east tower, the room where 3 generations of Winterbourne wealth had been kept under lock, bar, and the watchful eye of a hired guard. The guard was there still, looking baffled and faintly ill. The heavy door stood ajar. Anthony stepped inside and felt the floor seem to tilt beneath him. The room was empty, not ransacked, nothing so crude as that. No broken locks, no forced hinges, no signs of violence at all. It had simply been cleared, methodically and completely, as though the shelves had never held anything to begin with. Jessica's private jewel chests were gone. Yes, the sapphires from her mother, the pearls he'd given her as a wedding gift, he now bitterly regretted. But so was everything else. The bearer bonds that secured his standing with 3 separate London banking houses, the property deeds for the outlying farms, the small store of gold reserves that had, for 200 years, quietly underwritten the entire Duchy of Winterbourne in years of poor harvest or unwise investment. All of it vanished. "When," Anthony said, his voice unnaturally flat, "was this room last inspected?" Hollis wrung his hands. "A fortnight past, Your Grace. Everything was in its place then. I would swear to it on my life." "Then someone has robbed me blind under my own roof, and no one thought to mention it," Anthony snapped, though even as the words left him, some colder part of his mind was already turning over the timing, the precision, the absence of any forced entry at all. A thief left chaos behind. This left only a terrible, deliberate emptiness. He sent riders that very afternoon to Leeds and to York, demanding word from every banking house that held Winterbourne paper. The replies did not come quickly, and when they did, over the following days, they brought no comfort at all. The merchant bank that had, for as long as Anthony could remember, held the mortgage against a considerable portion of Winterbourne's northern acreage informed him, with the careful, distant courtesy reserved for men no longer considered creditworthy, that his mortgage had, in fact, been sold. Purchased entire, principal and interest, some 3 months prior. Sold to whom? Anthony demanded of the clerk, who delivered the news in person, having ridden out from Leeds specifically to avoid putting such delicate information to paper. The clerk consulted his own notes with visible discomfort. The purchasing party registered themselves only as the Blackwood Consortium, Your Grace, a private concern. The transaction was conducted through solicitors in London, and I regret to say the bank was not made privy to the identity of the principals involved. Such arrangements are not uncommon among discreet investors. 3 months, Anthony repeated slowly, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the draft from the study window. 3 months meant the sale had been arranged well before Christmas Eve. Well before the deed of separation, well before Jessica had ever risen from her chair at that long table and handed him her quiet, devastating farewell. Whatever this was, it had not begun with her departure. Her departure had only been the moment she'd decided he no longer needed to be kept in the dark about it. He thought of her face across the table that night, composed, untroubled, watching him laugh with Penelope, as though she were watching a play she had already read the ending to. Find out who sits behind this consortium, Anthony told Hollis that evening, pacing the length of his study while the fire guttered low and unattended. I don't care what it costs. I want a name. But even as he said it, a small and unwelcome thought had begun to take root somewhere beneath his fury, a thought he pushed away as quickly as it surfaced, because to entertain it felt absurd, felt impossible, felt like crediting his quiet, unremarkable wife with a mind sharper and colder than any he'd encountered in a London counting house. Jessica had asked no questions in 7 years of marriage. He was only beginning to understand that a woman who asks no questions is not always a woman with nothing to say. Sometimes she is simply a woman who has already learned every answer she needs and is waiting, with immense and terrible patience, for the moment to use them. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, steady and unhurried, settling over the empty strong room and the empty vaults and the empty place at the head of the table where, for 7 Christmases, a quiet Duchess had sat and watched and counted and waited. The Great North Road in late December was no place for a man in a hurry, but Anthony rode it anyway, 2 postilions struggling to keep pace behind him as the wind cut sideways across the open moor and the light thickened toward an early, bruised dusk. He had convinced himself, somewhere in the space of 2 sleepless nights, that Jessica must have fled to Westmoreland. It was the only place that made sense to him. Her father's estate, however diminished, however far from fashionable circles, was still the one roof in England she might call her own by right of birth rather than marriage. A woman running from her husband runs home. That was what he told himself, over and over, as the miles unspooled beneath his horse's hooves and the snow came on harder, past Ripon. He did not consider, even once, that a woman clever enough to empty a locked strong room without leaving a single scratch on the door might also be clever enough to know exactly where her husband would look first. The journey took the better part of 3 days, delayed twice by drifts across the turnpike and once by a lamed horse that cost him 4 hours he did not have to spare. By the time he reached the low stone gates of the Ashworth estate, Jessica's past home, a modest manor house that had clearly seen better decades. His temper had worn thin as the ice on the carriage windows, and his patience had worn thinner still. An elderly butler answered the door, a man so old and so slow that Anthony very nearly pushed past him without waiting for an answer to be given at all. "The Duchess," Anthony said, not bothering with any of the courtesies he'd been raised to observe. "Where is she?" The butler blinked at him with the mild confusion of a man roused from a long, undisturbed nap. "Her Grace, sir? I've not laid eyes on Miss Jessica, beg pardon, the Duchess, since her wedding, sir. 7 years gone, near enough." Anthony pushed past him regardless, boots ringing hollow on the flagstones of a hall that smelled of dust and cold hearths and long disuse. He searched the house himself, room by shuttered room, finding nothing but sheeted furniture and the particular silence of a home that had not properly welcomed a family in some years. There was no fresh linen anywhere, no fire laid in any grate but the small one in the housekeeper's own quarters, no sign that a woman fleeing a scandal had passed through these halls at all. "Her father's affairs," Anthony said finally, turning on the old butler with something close to desperation now creeping beneath his fury. "The debts against this house. Who holds them?" The butler's face, which had been merely confused, now took on a note of genuine surprise. "Why? No one holds them any longer, sir. Cleared, they were, root and branch, some 6 weeks past. A gentleman came from a London banking house, very correct, very quiet about it, and settled the whole of it in a single afternoon. Master Ashworth's man of business wept, sir, if you'll pardon my saying so. 20 years of debt, gone in an afternoon. 6 weeks, before the mortgage sale, before the ball, before any of it." Anthony stood very still in the cold hallway of a house that held no answers for him, and felt, for the first time since Christmas Eve, something closer to fear than fury. He left within the hour, riding back toward the London road with his postilions grumbling behind him, no closer to finding his wife than when he'd set out, and considerably further from understanding her. Some 60 miles to the south, in a low-beamed private parlor of a coaching inn just off the London road, a very different scene was unfolding. Jessica sat before a small fire, her travel cloak, heavy, plain, unremarkable, the sort of garment no one would look at twice, draped over the back of a chair, already discarded. In its place, she wore a sharply tailored riding habit of deep gray wool, its cut precise and businesslike, in a way no Yorkshire ballroom had ever seen on her. Across the narrow table sat a thin, precise man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched low on his nose, Mr. Aldous Crane, solicitor, and for the past 4 years the only person in England who knew the full shape of what Jessica had built. "The Westmoreland debts are cleared and recorded," Crane said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your father's man of business believes it was an act of providence. I did not correct him." "Let him believe what comforts him," Jessica said, opening the folder without any particular hurry. Inside lay a set of transfer documents, signed and countersigned, the ink still faintly fresh. "And the coal leases? Signed over from the Whitby Holding Company yesterday morning. You now control the mineral rights beneath 11,000 acres of what was, until recently, your husband's northern land." Crane paused, watching her over the rim of his spectacles with something that might have been admiration, carefully restrained. "May I ask, Your Grace, whether you intend to tell him any of this yourself, or whether he is meant to discover the whole of it by degrees, as he has so far?" Jessica set down the folder and looked into the fire for a long moment, her expression unreadable, the flames catching faint amber light in eyes that had spent 7 years learning to give nothing away. "By degrees," she said finally. He spent 7 Christmases assuming I understood nothing of what passed beneath my own roof. I find I'm in no hurry to correct that impression all at once. Let him chase me through every empty house in England first, Mr. Crane. Let him learn what it costs to look for a woman he never once thought to truly see. Outside, the snow had begun again, falling soft and steady over the London road, over Westmoreland, over the whole cold, unsuspecting length of England, while somewhere behind them, a duke rode north into an empty house, chasing a wife who had already left every trail he might have followed cold. London greeted Anthony with fog so thick it swallowed the tops of the townhouses along Grosvenor Square, a gray, choking blanket that seemed to press down on the whole city and everyone fool enough to be out in it. He had ridden south from Yorkshire in a foul temper and arrived in a fouler one, 3 days of failed searching behind him and nothing to show for it but exhaustion and a growing, uneasy dread he refused to name. The dread found a name for itself soon enough. His townhouse on Curzon Street, when he finally reached it past midnight, had a knot of men gathered outside, despite the hour and the cold. Tradesmen mostly, and one grim-faced solicitor's clerk holding a lantern and a leather folder stuffed thick with papers. They descended on him the moment his carriage stopped, voices overlapping, demanding settlement of accounts he'd assumed, in the careless way of men who had never truly wanted for anything, would simply be seen to eventually. His wine merchant, his tailor, a jeweler he'd patronized rather too generously for Lady Penelope's benefit. All of them, it seemed, had heard something in the past week that had made them suddenly, urgently unwilling to extend further credit to the Duke of Winterbourne. He pushed through them without answering, bolted the door behind him, and stood in his own dark hallway, breathing hard, as though he'd outrun something rather than simply walked past it. By morning, the truth of it had already spread through every gentleman's club in St. James's, the way such things always did. Not through any single dramatic announcement, but through 100 small conversations over coffee and newspapers, a raised eyebrow here, a lowered voice there. Winterbourne's credit had collapsed. No one seemed entirely certain why, only that it had, swiftly and completely, and that the great houses of London banking had quietly agreed, without ever needing to discuss it openly, that the Duke was no longer a man worth the risk. Anthony discovered the full extent of it at White's, where he was informed, with excruciating politeness, that his membership dues remained unpaid, and that perhaps it would be more comfortable for all concerned if he did not call again until matters were settled. He left the club in a fury that carried him halfway down St. James's Street before it curdled, once again, into something closer to panic. He went to Lord Ashford that same afternoon, Lady Penelope's father, a wealthy man with interests in shipping and a well-known fondness for elevating his family's connections wherever he could buy them. Anthony had never before had cause to ask the man for anything beyond his daughter's company at dinner. Now he sat in Ashford's overheated study, hat in his hands like a tradesman seeking work, and asked for a loan substantial enough to steady his affairs until he could untangle whatever had happened to his fortune. Ashford heard him out with the careful, unreadable patience of a man who had built his wealth by never once showing his hand before he needed to. "A difficult request, Your Grace," he said at last, folding his hands over his considerable stomach. "You understand my position. A man in trade must consider risk above sentiment. Whatever affection my daughter holds for your company, the loan, when it finally came, was smaller than Anthony had hoped, and hedged about with conditions that made his jaw ache with the effort of accepting them gracefully. It was not enough. He knew it even as he signed the papers. It was a bandage over a wound that was still, somewhere beneath the surface, bleeding freely. Penelope's warmth, which had seemed so effortless and so constant through the autumn, cooled with a speed that startled even Anthony, who had by now grown almost accustomed to being startled. She had adored the theater boxes he'd kept, the gowns he'd settled her dressmaker's accounts for, the easy generosity of a man who had never once had to think twice about spending. When that generosity faltered, so did she. Her letters grew shorter, her invitations to call grew fewer. When he did see her, at a small gathering hosted by mutual acquaintance, she spoke to him with the polished, distant courtesy she might have shown a pleasant stranger, her eyes already drifting toward a young naval officer with a comfortable inheritance and considerably steadier prospects. "You've grown quiet, Your Grace," she said to him once, over the rim of her glass, with a small smile that held no real warmth in it at all. "It doesn't suit you." He had no answer for that. He was beginning to understand that he had very few answers left for anything. The final blow of that week arrived quietly, almost gently, in the form of a letter from his own man of business, delivered while Anthony sat alone in his darkened study, nursing a brandy he could no longer, in good conscience, afford. The letter informed him, in careful and regretful language, that the mortgage on his London residence, the very house in which he sat reading the letter, had been purchased in full by an undisclosed party, through solicitors who had declined, politely but absolutely, to identify their client. Anthony read the letter twice, then set it down and sat very still in the firelight, listening to the fog press against the windows. Every debt, every mortgage, every ounce of credit that had once made him one of the most comfortable men in England, quietly, methodically bought up by hands he could not see, arranged by a mind he was only now beginning to suspect he had spent 7 years failing to recognize at all. He thought of Jessica's face at the ball, calm, composed, watching him, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, the fear in him sharpened into something closer to certainty. Somewhere in London, someone was closing a net around him with patient, deliberate hands. And whoever it was, Anthony was beginning to suspect, with a dread he could no longer push aside, had been closing it for a very long time before he'd ever noticed it tightening at all. By the second week of January, Anthony had grown desperate enough to do something he would once have considered beneath a man of his standing. He hired a private inquiry agent. The man's name was Thomas Rourke, a former Bow Street runner who had left the force some years prior to work independently for gentlemen who required discretion above all else. He arrived at Curzon Street in a plain brown coat, unremarkable in every way except for a pair of sharp, watchful eyes that seemed to catalogue everything in a room within moments of entering it. Anthony explained what little he understood of his situation: the emptied vaults, the sold mortgages, the vanished Duchess, the mysterious Blackwood consortium that seemed to sit behind every ruin that had befallen him since Christmas Eve. Rourke listened without interrupting, made a few brief notes in a small leather book, and asked only one question before he left. "Your Grace, in 7 years of marriage, did you ever have occasion to review your wife's private correspondence or the accounts of her personal allowance?" Anthony opened his mouth to answer, then found he had nothing to say. He had never once thought to look. Rourke worked for 8 days. He returned to Curzon Street on a gray, drizzling afternoon in mid-January, with a folder considerably thicker than the one he'd carried in, and a manner considerably more careful than before, as though he were bringing news he suspected his employer would not welcome. "Your Grace," he began, seating himself only after Anthony gestured impatiently for him to do so, "I must tell you plainly that what I have found does not concern thieves or enemies from outside your household. It concerns your wife, "I assumed as much," Anthony said, though his voice had gone tight. Rourke opened his folder and laid out, page by page, a story that took the better part of an hour to tell in full, and that left Anthony sitting motionless by the end of it, his brandy forgotten and going warm in his hand. For the past 7 years, nearly the whole of their marriage, Jessica had been operating through a proxy broker in the city, a quiet, unremarkable man named Silas Whitmore, who worked from a narrow office near the Royal Exchange and who had, until Rourke's careful digging turned up his name, remained entirely invisible to anyone in Anthony's circle. Through Whitmore, Jessica had accessed a modest inheritance from her late mother's family, a Baltic shipping fortune, largely forgotten by the rest of the Ashworth family, tied up for years in disputed estates and slow-moving legal claims that Anthony had never once thought worth investigating when he'd married her. Jessica had not left it forgotten. She had spent years untangling the legal claims herself, quietly, through Crane's predecessor, and once the funds were freed, she had not spent them on gowns or jewels or the small comforts a duchess might reasonably indulge in. She had invested them, methodically and with startling success, in East India ventures, cargo insurance, tea shipments, and later, as her confidence and her capital both grew, direct stakes in trading vessels themselves. She was, by my estimation, worth in excess of £40,000 in her own right within 4 years of your marriage, Rourke said, watching Anthony's face carefully as he delivered the figure. And she did not stop there, Your Grace. Once her own fortune was secure, she began purchasing your debts. Anthony's head came up sharply. My debts, my gambling debts. Through third parties, yes, small sums at first, £100 here, 200 there, bought quietly from the tradesmen and moneylenders you owed, always through fronts that never once bore her name. I suspect, though I cannot yet prove it fully, that she began this practice as early as your 3rd year of marriage. Rourke paused, choosing his next words with visible care. By the time of your Christmas Eve ball, Your Grace, I believe she held, directly or through the Blackwood Consortium, the greater part of every debt you owed in England. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Anthony, the way it had in the empty strong room weeks before, though this time the emptiness he felt was not in a vault, but somewhere considerably closer to the center of his chest. 7 years. 7 years of dismissing her at dinner parties as the quiet one, the provincial wife who understood little of business and cared less. 7 years of never once asking what she did with her mornings while he slept off the previous night's excesses, never once wondering why she kept a private writing desk locked when nothing of consequence he'd always assumed could possibly be inside it. Why, Anthony said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, would she build all this in secret? Why not simply leave me, if she found the marriage so intolerable? Why the years of patience? Why the ruin? Rourke closed his folder slowly. That, Your Grace, I cannot tell you. My inquiries extend only to what was done, not to why. For that, I suspect, you would need to ask the Duchess herself. Though I confess, he added, with the first flicker of something like genuine sympathy crossing his weathered face, in my experience, a person does not spend 7 years building so careful and so patient a design without a reason that runs a good deal deeper than a husband's infidelity alone. Whatever drove her to this, Your Grace, I would wager it began well before you ever met her. He left shortly after, promising to continue his inquiries into the Blackwood Consortium's full holdings, though Anthony scarcely heard the parting words. He sat alone in his study, long after Rourke's footsteps had faded down the stairs, staring into a fire that had burned down to embers, turning over 7 years of small, dismissed moments in his mind. Jessica's locked desk, her quiet mornings spent in her private sitting room, the careful, unreadable calm she had worn through every humiliation he had ever handed her, at every dinner, every ball, every long, silent evening he had never once thought to fill with a single honest question. He had married a woman he had never once truly looked at, and somewhere in London, patient and unhurried, that woman was still watching him now, exactly as she had watched him for 7 years, and Anthony understood, with a dread that settled into his bones like the January cold outside, that he had not yet begun to see the full shape of what she intended to do with everything she had built. Almac's assembly rooms on a Wednesday evening in January stood as close to sacred ground as fashionable London possessed, and Anthony, for all that his fortunes had crumbled around him these past weeks, still held vouchers enough to walk through its doors. He clung to that fact with a kind of desperate pride. Whatever else had been stripped from him, he was still received. He still had a name, a title, a face people recognized across a crowded ballroom. He told himself that would be enough to begin rebuilding what he'd lost, if only he could find the right ear to bend, the right influential guest to charm into overlooking the ugly rumors now trailing him through every drawing room in the city. He arrived with Lady Penelope on his arm, a last brittle attempt at appearances, though her smile that evening had the fixed, polite quality of a woman performing a duty rather than enjoying a pleasure. She had agreed to accompany him only after considerable persuasion, and Anthony suspected, though he did not allow himself to examine the thought too closely, that her father had encouraged the arrangement chiefly to observe, at close range, whether the Duke's fortunes showed any sign of recovering. The rooms were crowded, warm with candlelight and the low hum of 100 conversations, the orchestra tuning in the far corner, while patronesses moved through the crowd with the watchful authority of women who had, between them, decided the fate of half the marriages in England. Anthony had begun, with some effort, a conversation with Lord Castlereagh's under-secretary, a man whose good opinion might yet prove useful, when the doors at the far end of the room opened, and the conversation around him died as though someone had drawn a curtain across it. He turned, along with nearly everyone else in the room, to see who had caused so sudden and complete a silence. Jessica stood in the doorway. She wore mourning silk, deep and unrelieved black, cut with a severity that should have made her fade into the shadowed edges of the room, and instead achieved precisely the opposite effect, drawing every eye toward the single point of brightness at her throat, the winter-born diamond and emerald necklace, the historic heirloom that had passed down through 6 generations of Anthony's family, and that had been, as far as Anthony had known until this very moment, lost. Sold off, he'd always been told as a boy, by some spendthrift great-grandfather 2 generations back, its whereabouts a family mystery no one had ever managed to solve. It sat now at his wife's throat, catching the candlelight in sharp, deliberate flashes of green and white, and the sight of it struck Anthony with a force that nearly buckled his knees. She was not alone. Flanking her, with the easy, practiced courtesy of men accustomed to moving through the highest circles of government, stood 2 gentlemen Anthony recognized at once, members of the Privy Council, men whose good opinion could make or ruin a career with a single quiet word in the right chamber. They spoke to Jessica with evident warmth, one of them offering his arm as they moved together into the room, and Jessica accepted it with the same composed, untroubled grace she had shown across the dinner table on Christmas Eve, as though she had never once been the quiet, overlooked Duchess Anthony had spent 7 years dismissing. The whispers began almost immediately, a rustling wave moving through the assembled guests. Anthony heard fragments of it as he pushed his way across the room, half-formed and cruelly delighted. The Winterborn emeralds, thought lost for decades, however did she come by them, and on her own, without him, imagine. And did you hear about the mortgages? He reached her at last, near the edge of the dance floor, and found himself standing before his own wife, for the first time since she had handed him a folded deed of separation and walked from his hall. "Jessica," he said, low and urgent, aware of the eyes already fixed on them from every direction. "A word, if you'd allow me." She turned to him with an expression of mild, polite inquiry, the kind one might offer a stranger who had mistaken you for someone else entirely. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to catch it, pitched with perfect, devastating courtesy. "Have we been introduced?" The words landed like a slap, sharper for the calm with which she delivered them. Anthony felt the blood rise in his face, felt the eyes of the room pressing in from every side, felt Penelope's hand tighten briefly on his arm before withdrawing altogether, as though even she could not bear to be seen too closely associated with the spectacle unfolding before them. "Jessica," he said again, quieter now, almost pleading despite himself, "you know precisely who I am." "I'm afraid you have mistaken me for someone, Your Grace," she said, using his title now with a precision that made it sound like an accusation rather than a courtesy. "Though I confess, the confusion is understandable. So many titled gentlemen in this room tonight." She let the smallest pause settle before adding, almost gently, "Perhaps you ought to consult your creditors. I understand they've taken rather a close interest in your affairs of late." A ripple of stifled laughter moved through the small circle of guests, near enough to overhear, and Anthony understood, with a sickening clarity, that whatever remained of his standing in London society had just been extinguished as thoroughly and as publicly as a candle pinched between two fingers. Jessica did not linger to enjoy the damage. She inclined her head, the emeralds catching the light one final time, and allowed her Privy Council escort to lead her toward the dance floor, leaving Anthony standing alone at its edge, his own wife's polite, unanswerable dismissal ringing in his ears, louder than the orchestra now striking up behind him. He did not remain at Almack's much longer that night. There was little point. Word of the encounter would be halfway across Mayfair by morning regardless, embroidered and retold at a dozen breakfast tables. And Anthony understood, walking out into the cold January night alone, that his wife had not simply humiliated him in front of London's most powerful drawing room. She had announced, with a single sentence and a borrowed smile, that the Duke of Winterborn no longer existed to her at all. The gaming house off Piccadilly kept no name above its door, only a brass knocker shaped like a fox's head, and admission by nothing more than a nod from the porter, who knew every gentleman fool enough to still owe money there. Anthony had not meant to return to such places. He had told himself, riding back from Almack's in humiliated silence, that he would spend the following weeks in quiet retrenchment, rebuilding what little credit remained to him through patience rather than further recklessness. He lasted 11 days. It was Penelope who summoned him there. In the end, a short note delivered by her maid requesting he meet her at 10 o'clock, private room, no explanation offered, beyond her name at the bottom of the page. He went anyway. Some part of him, foolish and still clinging to the wreckage of what they'd once had, hoped she meant to offer comfort, perhaps even reconciliation, now that the worst of the scandal had settled into something almost ordinary. She was waiting for him in a small back parlor above the main gaming floor, seated at a card table with a single candle burning between them, and the moment Anthony saw her face, composed, faintly amused, entirely without the warmth she'd once performed so convincingly for his benefit. He understood this was no reconciliation. "You look unwell, Your Grace," she said, not troubling to rise. "Financial ruin does age a man so terribly. You asked me here to mock me, Penelope. I asked you here to discuss a matter of business." She reached into a small velvet reticule and drew out a folded letter, its seal already broken, and slid it across the table toward him with 2 fingers, as though reluctant to touch it longer than necessary. "Do you recognize this correspondence, Your Grace?" Anthony's hand went cold before he'd even fully unfolded the page. He recognized the handwriting instantly, his own, from 18 months prior, a letter he'd written in a moment of desperate financial need to a merchant contact in Calais, arranging for a quantity of French brandy and lace to be landed quietly along the Sussex coast, well clear of customs officers and the duties that would otherwise have ruined the venture's profit entirely. It had seemed, at the time, a minor indiscretion, the sort of thing half the peerage engaged in when the war made luxury goods scarce and expensive through legitimate channels. He had not considered, writing it, that England remained at war with France, and that a letter arranging trade with the enemy might, in less generous hands, be read as something considerably graver than smuggling. "Where did you get this?" he said, his voice gone hoarse. "That hardly matters now, does it?" Penelope folded her hands atop the table, watching him with the same cool, assessing patience a merchant might show a debtor. "What matters, Your Grace, is what becomes of it. I understand certain gentlemen at the War Office take a very dim view of correspondence suggesting treasonous trade with the enemy. I understand a man's title offers rather less protection against such accusations than one might hope, particularly a man whose finances have grown so conveniently suspicious of late." Anthony stared at her, the pieces arranging themselves with sickening speed. "You mean to blackmail me?" "I mean to be compensated," Penelope said, entirely unruffled by the word, for the considerable inconvenience of having wasted the better part of a year on a man who turned out to have nothing left worth having. £5,000, Your Grace, and this letter finds its way quietly back into your possession, never to trouble either of us again." He very nearly laughed, though nothing about the moment held any humor in it at all. "I haven't £500 to my name at present, let alone 5,000. "Then I suggest you find it," she said, rising now, gathering her shawl with the brisk efficiency of a woman concluding a transaction rather than ending an affair. "You have a fortnight." She left him alone in the small parlor with the candle guttering low and the letter still trembling faintly in his hand. And it was only sitting there, in the smoke-thick quiet of the gaming house, that the full shape of it settled over him. Penelope had never simply drifted into his path by chance at the start of the season, laughing too readily at his jokes, admiring his box at the opera with such convenient enthusiasm. Someone had placed her there, deliberately, months before Christmas Eve, a bright, expensive distraction perfectly calculated to appeal to a vain man's weaknesses, positioned exactly where she might do the most damage once the moment came to collect on the investment. He thought of Jessica's calm face at the ball. He thought of the 7 years of careful, patient building Rourke had uncovered, and he understood, with a cold certainty that settled somewhere beneath his ribs, that even Penelope, his own mistress, the woman he'd flaunted so proudly across his own dinner table, had likely been another quiet thread in a net that had been closing around him for far longer than he'd ever suspected. He had nowhere left to turn but toward the very source of his ruin. It took 3 days and a considerable bribe to a clerk at the solicitor's offices Anthony's own man of business had identified as handling the Blackwood Consortium's affairs before he managed to secure so much as an audience request. The clerk returned his letter unanswered for 2 of those days, and when a reply finally came, it arrived not as the meeting he'd requested, but as a single printed card, stiff and formal, bearing an address near Cornhill and a date less than a week away. You are invited to attend the sale of certain properties and holdings at the Baltic Coffee House, the 8th of February, at 11 o'clock in the forenoon. No signature, no explanation, only the address and the date, and beneath it, in smaller script, a single line that Anthony read 3 times before its meaning fully settled over him, cold and absolute as the January frost still gripping the city outside his window. The Duchy of Winterbourne, in its entirety, to be sold to the highest bidder. The Baltic Coffee House on Cornhill had, for the better part of a century, served as one of London's quieter centres of serious commerce. Its low-beamed rooms, thick with pipe smoke, and the murmured business of merchants who preferred their transactions conducted away from the more theatrical drama of the exchange floor itself. On the 8th of February, its largest room had been cleared of its usual tables and filled instead with rows of chairs, every seat occupied well before 11 o'clock struck, and a raised platform at the far end where an auctioneer's lectern stood waiting beneath a chandelier of guttering candles. Anthony arrived early and found himself seated, by whatever cruel accident of arrangement, in the second row, close enough to the platform that he would be unable to look away from whatever unfolded there. The room hummed with low conversation as the gathered creditors, solicitors, and speculators settled into their seats. Men Anthony recognized from White's, from the Exchange, from a dozen drawing rooms where he had once been welcomed as one of the most eligible dukes in England. None of them met his eye directly. A few offered small, uncomfortable nods, the kind reserved for a man attending his own funeral. He understood, sitting there in the smoke-thick warmth, that he had become a spectacle rather than a participant, and that everyone in the room knew it, save, perhaps, himself, until this very moment. The auctioneer, a brisk, precise man named Mr. Fenwick, mounted the platform at the stroke of 11 and began without ceremony, reading from a thick sheaf of papers the full and considerable inventory of what was about to be sold. The ancestral lands of Winterbourne, some 14,000 acres across 3 counties, the timber rights along the northern boundary, uncut and valuable, the title deeds to the manor house itself, its stables, its home farm, its tenant cottages, and the rents attached to each. All of it, Fenwick explained in a flat, business-like tone that made no allowance for the fact that a man's entire inheritance was being dismantled before him, forfeit under the terms of defaulted mortgages now held, in their entirety, by the Blackwood Consortium. Anthony had known, in some distant, theoretical way, that this moment was coming. He had not understood, until Fenwick's gavel rose for the first time and the bidding opened on the timber rights alone, how it would actually feel to sit powerless while his family's 400-year inheritance was carved apart and sold, lot by lot, to men who discussed the value of his ancestral woodland with the same brisk interest they might have shown a shipment of cotton. He tried, twice, to raise his own hand and enter the bidding, some desperate, doomed instinct refusing to accept the inevitability of what was happening. Both times, a quiet word from Fenwick's clerk reminded him, not unkindly, that a man already in default upon the property in question held no standing to bid upon its recovery. He was permitted only to watch. The timber rights sold within minutes to a Leeds merchant. The tenant farms went next, parceled and auctioned in groups, the bidding brisk and businesslike, until the room's attention sharpened considerably as Fenwick reached the largest and final lot of the morning. The manor house itself, its surrounding parkland, and the ducal title's remaining income entire. The bidding opened modestly, climbed steadily through a dozen exchanges between 3 or 4 serious parties, and then, with startling speed, began to rise beyond anything the room had anticipated. A voice near the back, a proxy, Anthony realized, some agent bidding on behalf of a client who remained carefully unseen, began raising each offer by sums so large that the other bidders fell away one by one, first the Leeds merchant, then a baronet from Kent, then finally the last serious rival, a banking consortium representative who shook his head and folded his hands in visible defeat. "Sold," Fenwick announced, his gavel coming down with a crack that seemed to Anthony louder than any sound he'd ever heard, to the gentleman bidding on behalf of the proxy. A thin man in unremarkable gray rose from his seat near the back of the room. Every head turned toward him, Anthony's included, waiting for the name that would finally reveal the mind behind the Blackwood Consortium, the architect of the entire ruin he had endured these past 7 weeks. The proxy did not speak. He simply turned and gestured upward toward the small private gallery that overlooked the main room from above, reserved traditionally for those who preferred to observe the exchange's business without descending to the trading floor itself. Every eye in the room followed the gesture, Anthony's own rising last of all, some part of him already understanding, with a dread that had been building for weeks now, and finally arrived at its full, terrible weight, exactly what he was about to see. Jessica stood at the gallery railing. She wore deep blue this time, not morning black, her posture as composed and unhurried as it had been across the dinner table on Christmas Eve, as it had been at Almack's, when she'd looked through him as though he were a stranger. She looked down at the room below her, at the auctioneer, at the scattered creditors, at her own husband sitting frozen in the second row, with an expression that held no triumph in it, no cruelty even, only a quiet, settled finality, the look of a woman who had finished a long and difficult piece of work and found, at last, that it had come out exactly as she'd planned. The room erupted into a low, astonished murmur, a dozen conversations breaking out at once as the assembled gentlemen turned to one another in disbelief, piecing together aloud what Anthony had already, in the space of a single frozen heartbeat, understood completely. The proxy, the consortium, the emptied vaults, the sold mortgages, the coal leases, the 7 quiet years Rourke had uncovered, all of it converged, in that moment, into a single, unbearable fact standing above him at the gallery rail. His own wife had just purchased his entire inheritance out from under him, in front of every man of consequence in London, and she had done it without once raising her voice, without once losing the calm, composed dignity he had spent 7 years mistaking for emptiness. Jessica held his gaze for a long moment across the crowded room, neither smiling nor looking away, and then, with the same unhurried grace with which she had once risen from a dinner table and handed him a folded deed of separation, she turned from the railing and disappeared from view, leaving Anthony alone among the wreckage of everything he had once believed was permanently, unshakably his. It took Anthony 10 days to find her, and even then he understood, walking down toward the East India docks through a fog thick with the smell of tar and river mud, that he had found her only because she had allowed it. A woman who could vanish so completely from Winterbourne, who could build an empire of shipping and coal and clear debts without a single whisper reaching him across 7 years of marriage, did not remain hidden from a determined husband unless she wished it. She wished, it seemed, to be found now, on ground of her own choosing. The warehouse stood among a row of similar buildings along the riverfront, its great doors thrown open to the gray afternoon light, dock hands moving crates of tea and silk and spice down a gangplank from a vessel Anthony recognized, with a fresh jolt of disbelief, as bearing the Ashworth shipping mark newly painted across its hull, the very fleet Jessica's family had once controlled, restored now under her own hand. He found her standing near the far end of the warehouse floor, dressed plainly for once, a ledger tucked beneath one arm as she oversaw the unloading with the brisk, competent authority of a woman entirely at home among crates and rope and shouting dockhands. She did not startle when she saw him approaching. She had, he suspected, known he was coming for some time before he ever reached the door. "You found me," she said, without turning fully toward him. "I rather thought you would, eventually." 7 years, Anthony said, his voice rough with a fatigue that had nothing to do with the walk down from Curzon Street. 7 years, Jessica, and I never once suspected any of this. Why? I want to hear you say it. Why did you ruin me so completely, so patiently, when you might simply have left? Jessica set down her ledger at last, and turned to face him fully, the fog behind her softening the harsh lines of the warehouse into something almost dreamlike, though her expression held nothing dreamlike at all, only a cold, settled clarity that had been building, Anthony understood now, for far longer than the 7 years of their marriage alone. "Do you know anything of your grand-uncle, Anthony? Edmund Winterbourne, the 6th Duke's younger brother?" Anthony frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Only a little. He held some interest in trade, I believe, before the title passed to my grandfather." "He held rather more than an interest," Jessica said, her voice level and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this explanation many times in the quiet of her own mind, waiting for the moment she would finally speak it aloud. "My grandfather, Josiah Ashworth, built a shipping fleet from nothing, 6 vessels trading between London and the Baltic, built through 30 years of his own labor and risk. Your granduncle Edmund held a minority share in the venture, a small investment made in his youth, and when my grandfather fell ill and the business faced a difficult season of debt, Edmund used his position on the board to force a sale of the entire fleet at a fraction of its worth, to a buyer who turned out, though it took my family years to discover it, to be Edmund himself, hiding behind a second name." Anthony stood very still, the fog pressing cold against his face, understanding beginning to arrive in slow, sickening pieces. "My grandfather was gone within the year, broken by it," Jessica continued. "My father, who had neither the temperament nor the training for trade, inherited nothing but the family name and a house slowly falling into disrepair. We were not always the quiet, modest family you married into, Anthony. We were ruined, deliberately, by a Winterbourne, 2 generations before you ever set eyes on me at my own father's dinner table. And when I offered for you, I saw an opportunity I had been waiting my whole life to recognize, should it ever appear," Jessica said simply. "Not revenge alone, though I won't pretend that played no part in it. A reckoning. The Winterbourne fortune had been built, in some measure, on the ruin of my family's fortune. I intended, from the very first year of our marriage, to reclaim what was taken, and I understood, early on, that a man as careless with money as you would eventually hand me every opportunity I required, if only I had the patience to wait for it." 7 years of patience, Anthony said, half to himself, the enormity of it settling over him at last. "Watching me gamble, watching me borrow, watching me humiliate you with Penelope at my own table, and saying nothing." "Saying nothing," Jessica agreed, because every reckless choice you made brought me a little closer to what I intended. You did the ruining yourself, Anthony, far more thoroughly than I ever could have managed alone. I merely made certain that when the ruin came, it came into hands that had been waiting a very long time to receive it. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman he had shared a table and a bed and 7 Christmases with, and understood that he had never once truly known her at all. Not the grief she carried for a grandfather, ruined before she was even born, not the cold, patient fury she'd carried through every dinner party where he'd flaunted his indifference, not the quiet brilliance with which she'd rebuilt an entire fortune from a forgotten Baltic inheritance, while the world dismissed her as unremarkable. "What now?" he said finally, the fight gone out of his voice entirely. "Winterbourne is yours. My credit, my name, my standing, all of it in ruins. What is left for you to take from me, Jessica?" Jessica studied him for a long moment, something almost like pity crossing her face before it settled back into its familiar, composed calm. "Nothing more, Anthony. There is nothing left worth taking. What remains is simply the settling of accounts, and that, I'm afraid, is already well underway." She turned back to her ledger, to the dock hands still unloading crates behind her, dismissing him as completely and as finally as she had at Almack's, and Anthony understood, walking back out into the fog along the riverfront, that whatever remained of the reckoning she had promised was already moving forward without any further need of his presence at all. Anthony returned to Yorkshire in the last week of February, riding north through a thaw that had turned the Great North Road to mud and slush, the snow retreating in patches across fields that would, in a few months, belong to men who had never set foot on them before this winter. He told himself, making the journey, that Winterbourne Manor at least remained his. The auction had claimed the surrounding lands, the timber, the tenant farms, but the house itself, the ancient seat of his family, still stood, and some stubborn, wounded part of him clung to the idea that within its walls he might yet find some remnant of the life he'd once had. He arrived to find the manor half empty already. Word had traveled faster than he had. Several of the household staff had given their notice weeks earlier, uncertain of wages that had grown increasingly unreliable, and those who remained moved through the cold corridors with none of the brisk cheerfulness Anthony remembered from Christmases past. Hollis alone remained steady, though even his careful composure had begun to show the strain of the past 2 months. Deep lines etched into a face that had aged considerably since Boxing Day. "There's little I can tell you that will bring comfort, Your Grace," Hollis said quietly, the evening Anthony arrived, as they sat together in a study, grown noticeably colder, for want of sufficient coal. "The creditors circle closer with each week. I've done what I can to hold them off, but I fear it amounts to very little now." Anthony spent that final week in a kind of numb suspension, walking the halls of the manor as though memorizing them, running his hand along banisters and door frames his family had touched for 4 generations, understanding on some level that he was saying goodbye to all of it, though he could not yet bring himself to think the word directly. The end, when it came, arrived without drama or warning, on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday morning near the close of February. Anthony was in the breakfast room, staring at a cup of tea he had no appetite to drink, when Hollis appeared in the doorway with an expression that told him everything before a single word had been spoken. "The sheriff has arrived, Your Grace, and Her Grace's solicitors." Anthony rose and walked to the front hall, where a party had already gathered at the great oak doors. The Sheriff of Yorkshire himself, a broad, weathered man with the grave, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news, flanked by 2 clerks, and Standing slightly apart from them, the same thin, precise man Anthony had briefly glimpsed once before, though he did not yet know the name Aldous Crane, nor understand the years of careful work the solicitor had put into this very morning. "Your Grace," the sheriff said, removing his hat with a courtesy that felt, to Anthony, almost cruel in its formality. "I come bearing a writ of foreclosure, issued by order of the courts, upon the property known as Winterbourne Manor, and all lands, structures, and income appertinent thereto, the whole of the estate having been found forfeit under the terms of defaulted mortgages, held in full by the Blackwood Consortium." He held out the document, and Anthony took it with hands that did not entirely feel like his own, scanning lines of dense legal language that amounted, in the end, to a single devastating fact. Everything, down to the last acre and the last stone of the manor house itself, now belonged to someone else. He retained only his title, the bare, empty honorific of Duke of Winterbourne, stripped of every estate, every income, every scrap of land that had once made the title mean anything at all. "You are permitted," the sheriff continued, with the same grave formality, "1 week's time to remove any personal effects not appurtenant to the estate itself. Beyond that date, Your Grace, I must ask that you vacate the premises entirely." Anthony stood in the doorway of the house he had been born in, holding a piece of paper that ended 400 years of Winterbourne history in a single stroke, and found he had nothing left to say. There was no argument left to make, no appeal that could undo what 7 years of patient, methodical work had already accomplished. He signed where the clerk indicated he must sign, his hand steady only through sheer force of will, and watched the small party depart, down the long drive, back toward the road, leaving him alone in a hall grown suddenly, unbearably large around him. He spent his final week at Winterbourne, moving through rooms already half-stripped of their old warmth, selecting the few personal effects the law permitted him to keep. A handful of clothes, a small portrait of his mother, a set of his father's dueling pistols that held no value beyond sentiment now. Hollis helped him pack in near silence, the old steward's own composure cracking only once, on the final evening, as he stood in the doorway of the great hall where Anthony had once presided over Christmas Eve balls that seemed now to belong to some other, unrecognizable life. 30 years I served this family, Your Grace," Hollis said, his voice unsteady. "I never thought to see the day." "Nor did I, Hollis," Anthony said quietly. "Nor did I." He left Winterbourne Manor on the first morning of March, riding out through the same eastern gate his wife had slipped through in the dark, 10 weeks before, though he traveled now not toward some deliberate, patient plan of his own, but toward nothing at all. No fortune, no standing, no clear notion of what a duke without a duchy was meant to become. Behind him, the manor stood gray and quiet under a sky heavy with the last threat of winter, already he understood, no longer his to look back upon at all. Spring came to London that year with a suddenness that felt almost indecent, as though the city had decided to forget the long gray months that came before it. By April, the plane trees along the carriage path in Hyde Park had softened into new green, and the fashionable world turned out each afternoon for the promenade with the same bright, unthinking enthusiasm it always had, as though nothing at all had changed in the great houses of England over the preceding winter. Anthony had changed considerably, though few who passed him now would have troubled to notice. He lived in 2 rooms above a chandler's shop in Bloomsbury, modest lodgings that would once have seemed to him barely fit for a groundskeeper, paid for out of a small quarterly allowance his creditors had, in a final grudging mercy, agreed to settle on him rather than see a duke reduced to outright begging in the streets. It was enough for lodging, plain meals, and little else. He had sold his father's dueling pistols within the first month, unable to justify the sentiment against the cost of coal. He walked everywhere now, having neither carriage nor horse to his name, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that London looked considerably different to a man who could no longer afford to ride above its streets. He had taken, in these past weeks, to walking in Hyde Park most fine afternoons, though he could not entirely have explained why, given that every face he passed there belonged to a world that no longer had any use for him. Perhaps it was simply habit, the last remaining shape of a life he still half remembered living. Perhaps some smaller, more honest part of him hoped, without quite admitting it, that he might see her. He saw her on the second Tuesday of April. A phaeton swept along the carriage path, dark green and sleek, drawn by a matched pair of thoroughbreds, groomed to a gloss that caught the afternoon light, and Anthony knew, even before he could make out the figure holding the reins, exactly who sat within it. Jessica drove herself, without a footman beside her, dressed in a deep wine-colored pelisse that suited her considerably better than the morning silk she'd worn at Almack's, her expression as composed and unhurried as it had been at every turn of the past 4 months, from the dinner table on Christmas Eve to the gallery above the auction floor at Cornhill. She was not alone in her standing, he noted, watching from the edge of the path. 2 gentlemen on horseback rode near her carriage, engaged in what appeared to be earnest, respectful conversation, and Anthony recognized, with a small, hollow ache, that one of them was a director of the East India Company, a man whose acquaintance Anthony himself had spent years trying and failing to properly cultivate. Jessica had achieved in a matter of months what he had never managed in a decade of trying: full, unquestioned entry into the highest circles of British trade and finance, circles that judged a person by the soundness of their ledgers rather than the age of their title, and had found her, by every account he'd heard whispered through what remained of his social connections, formidable. He stood very still at the edge of the carriage path as her phaeton drew nearer, some foolish, stubborn part of him bracing for the humiliation of being cut a 3rd time, publicly, in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to every drawing room in Mayfair by evening. It did not come. Jessica's eyes found his as the carriage drew level, and for a moment, brief and unhurried, she slowed the horse's pace, just enough to make the acknowledgement deliberate rather than accidental. She did not stop. She did not speak. She offered him instead a small, polite nod, precisely the kind of nod one might give a distant acquaintance passed on a fashionable street, containing neither warmth nor cruelty, neither triumph nor regret. It was, Anthony understood with sudden, aching clarity, exactly the nod she had given him across 100 dinner tables in the early years of their marriage, when he had been too careless to notice how carefully she was already watching him and how patiently she was already waiting. The phaeton moved on, back into the bright, indifferent current of the afternoon promenade, and within moments it had vanished among the other carriages, leaving no trace that the encounter had happened at all. Anthony remained standing at the edge of the path for a long while after she'd gone, watching the fashionable world continue its unbroken circuit around him, mothers and daughters, gentlemen on horseback, the whole glittering machinery of a society that had once counted him among its most privileged sons, and now, quite simply, did not think of him at all. He thought of Winterbourne Manor, standing empty under the last of the winter snow. He thought of his grand-uncle Edmund, a man he had never met, whose careless cruelty toward a struggling merchant family 2 generations past had planted a seed that had taken 30 years and one very patient woman to bring to its full, devastating harvest. He thought of every dismissed morning, every locked writing desk, every quiet dinner where he had looked across the table at his own wife and seen nothing worth truly looking at. He understood now, walking slowly back toward Bloomsbury as the afternoon light softened into evening, that Jessica had not ruined him out of simple cruelty, whatever comfort such a thought might once have offered him. She had ruined him the way a ledger is balanced, patiently, methodically, one careful entry correcting another until the sum came right at last. He had spent 7 years believing himself the master of his own house, never once suspecting that the quiet woman across his table had been, all along, the only person within it keeping an honest account. Behind him, somewhere among the bright carriages and blooming trees of Hyde Park, Duchess Jessica drove on into a future entirely her own making, and Duke Anthony walked forward into one considerably smaller than he had ever imagined for himself, understanding, at last and far too late, exactly what it had cost him to spend 7 years without ever truly seeing the woman he had married.